late last night, the Russian military began attacking targets all over Ukraine. We have a map of the attacks. It was not just in the eastern regions, the separatist regions of Ukraine, which is highlighted in that sort of shaded yellow on the right-hand side of the map. It is all over Ukraine, including near Kiev. The Russian military has crossed the border in a wide variety of places. This is, in fact, a full-scale assault on Ukraine. Vladimir Putin announced that this would happen last night. He is suggesting, of course, that this is denazification of Ukraine. He called the invasion a special operation, did the president of the Russian state. He suggested that this was, well, it was temporary. He said it's not going to be an occupation. We're just going to denazify. What he means by denazify, Zelensky, by the way, the president of Ukraine, is Jewish. He says he's going to denazify. What he means by this is that he is going to set up another Russian puppet state in Ukraine by deposing the current leadership of Ukraine. And if that means tens of thousands of casualties and millions of refugees, then so be it. Here was Vladimir Putin last night. He says, I decided to conduct a special military operation. It aims to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years. For that, we will strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. The reason that he is invoking the Nazis, of course, is because in the sort of Soviet mind, the idea that justified the Soviet regime was the resistance to the Nazis in World War II. Forget about the fact that they originally allied with the Nazis in World War II. It was the resistance to the Nazis in World War II. And so Putin is calling on that storied history in order to invoke some rationale for why, in fact, he is invading Ukraine at this point. The New York Times has live updates, and the live updates are stunning because you are seeing attack after attack on high-profile target after high-profile target. The videos are amazing. Here are some of the explosions in Kiev, for example. You can see the ordnance hitting. You can see the sky lighting up. A lot of these sorts of clips are going around, targets being blown up by the Russian military. This is not a quiet cleanup mission, as Putin likes to suggest. Everybody knows what this is. He's attempting to fully decapitate the Ukrainian administration, which had made the grave mistake for years of not being openly allied with the Russians. According to the New York Times, Ukrainian forces are in all-out defense mode to repel a multi-pronged Russian assault by land, sea, and air. The Ukrainian military claimed to have shot down several Russian military aircraft. Civilians lined up at recruitment offices to take up arms against Vladimir Putin's forces. More than 40 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed already. Dozens were wounded in fighting on Thursday morning, according to Alexei Arestovich, an advisor to President Vladimir Putin. The country's foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, said Ukraine was facing a full-scale attack from multiple directions, but that it continues to defend itself from Russian advance. Initial reports of the fighting suggested that Russian forces had crossed into Ukraine at multiple points, with helicopter-borne troops flying in under cover of machine gun fire, naval units coming ashore in the southern port city of Odessa, military vehicles crossing in from Crimea, that's the peninsula that Russia seized, to the west's nothing in 2014. Remember, the West did nothing in 2014 when they seized Crimea. So all of the areas that Russia had essentially seized have been used as staging points for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces said they had shot down several Russian fighters and a helicopter in an increasingly intense battle to maintain control over key cities. According to a senior Ukrainian military official, Ukrainian troops had also repelled Russian advances on two major cities, Chernihiv in the north near the Belarus border, which Belarus is allied with the Russians, and Kharkiv in the northeast, close to Russia. The Ukrainian army is badly outgunned and outmanned by Russian forces, but in one indication it was mounting resistance, two Russian armored personnel carriers were seen damaged. One crashed into a tree in an eastern Ukrainian town. Apparently, the refugees have already started to flow into Poland by the thousands, and it's likely to get worse. So we'll get into the details in 1 second. First, I think we have to understand exactly what's going on here. What's going on right here is, in fact, a challenge to the West. That doesn't mean that the West is in a place where it can put troops into Ukraine without fear of an all-out war with Russia. It also doesn't mean that sanctions are going to be sufficient to deter Russia. This is the natural outgrowth of decades of the West basically deciding after the Cold War that it was going to focus inward, that it was going to spend inordinate amounts of money, that it was going to cripple its own natural energy independence, that it was going to kowtow to aggressive foreign powers like China and Russia in order to avoid conflict. And it is no wonder that Russia has decided it's going to make a move like this. Now, we in the West don't understand this kind of move. We don't. We don't understand why China would try to take Hong Kong. We don't understand why the Taliban would try to take Afghanistan. We don't understand why Iran would be threatening Israel. We don't understand any of these things. And the reason we don't understand any of these things is because we in the West used to be animated by something like a higher purpose, the idea that we were a fundamental force in favor of freedom and liberty and what we used to call Western civilization. And we've lost that. And this has been an ongoing battle in the West for a very, very long time. The substitution of materialist hedonism in favor of some sort of higher purpose has been a serious battle. I was reading last night one of the best political essays ever written by George Orwell about Hitler. And this is not me saying that Vladimir Putin is Hitler, because Vladimir Putin is not Hitler. He's a thug dictator of a second-rate backwater economy with imperial aspirations. But he is not genocidal in the way that Hitler was, although he is in fact a murderer. But the essay is making a broader point, this Orwell essay. And I think it's important for us to understand this because we have a weird parochialism in the West. We like nice houses. We like nice cars. We like nice things. We like being able to speak freely. We like the lives that we've created. And we don't know why everybody doesn't see this as the end goal. You know, this is why we think that sanctions will work against Russia. Because, I mean, if we impoverish Russia, don't the Russians want to be more wealthy? Don't they want to have slightly nicer dashas? Don't they want to have better clothes? Don't they want to have Levi's? So George Orwell wrote about this in 1940. He said, Hitler has grasped the falsity of the hedonistic attitude to life. Nearly all Western thought since the last war, certainly all progressive thought, has assumed tacitly that human beings desire nothing beyond ease, security, and avoidance of pain. In such a view of life, there is no room, for instance, for patriotism in the military virtues. The socialist who finds his children playing with soldiers is usually upset, but he is never able to think of a substitute for the tin soldiers. Tin pacifists somehow won't do. Hitler, because in his own joyless mind he feels it with exceptional strength, knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. However they may be as economic theories, fascism and Nazism are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. The same is probably true of Stalin's militarized version of socialism. All three of the great dictators have enhanced their power by imposing intolerable burdens on their peoples. Whereas socialism and even capitalism in a more grudging way has said to people, I offer you a good time, Hitler has said to them, I offer you struggle, danger, and death, and as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. Perhaps later on they'll get sick of it and change their minds, as at the end of the last war. After a few years of slaughter and starvation, greatest happiness of the greatest number is a good slogan. But at the moment, better an end with honor than a horror without end is a winner. Now that we're fighting against the man who coined it, we ought not to underrate its emotional appeal. George Orwell wrote that in March of 1940, right before the all-out assault, the all-out assault on the continent had already begun by that point, by Hitler. Well, you see the same sort of feeling crop up for Vladimir Putin. People wonder why Putin is doing what he's doing. They keep calling him a madman. He's not a madman. Vladimir Putin has been very clear about his intentions. He wishes to reconstitute the Soviet Empire. It's why he's made aggressive moves in Georgia. It's why he's made aggressive moves in Ukraine before. It's why he's made aggressive moves in Kazakhstan. He's been very clear about this. He has said it over and over and over again. And in believing this, he is revivifying a belief in the Russian people. Because the fact is that since the end of the Cold War, there's been a tremendous amount of nostalgia in the former Soviet Union for the era of the Soviet Union. However much we may not understand it, the reality is that Stalin remains extraordinarily popular in polls in Russia. As of 2019, a record 70% of Russians approved of Joseph Stalin's role in Russian history. In the early 2000s, that was not the case. People saw Stalin as a hallmark of a bloody, terrible past. But Putin had revived the Soviet anthem, Soviet-style military parades, and Soviet-era medal for labor during his presidency. And by 2019, respondents said that 70%, that Stalin played a positive role in Russian history. Only 19% viewed Stalin's role negatively. Why? Because it turns out that there are a lot of people who are interested in the notion of Russian greatness. After all, what else do they have to substitute for it? A backwater economy? Understand the entire GDP of Russia, is about equivalent to the state of Florida. It's about $1.3 trillion per year. The state of Florida is at $1.2 trillion per year. This is not a major world power as an economy. It is a dump economically. So what exactly do you have to give your people? Except for dreams of glory and reconstitution of a Soviet empire. There's a great book called Secondhand Time, won the Nobel Prize in a few years back by a woman named Svetlana Alexievich. In this book, Secondhand Time, it's an oral history. So she interviewed a bunch of people about the Soviet era. And one of the people she interviewed was a former communist factory worker who'd been imprisoned and beaten half to death by the regime. So you would imagine that he didn't like the regime very much, right? Well, a year later, he was released, and then World War II broke out. And in the middle of World War II, he met the guy who had interrogated him, meaning who had tortured him. And that person said, we share a motherland. Well, now, in modern times, Alexievich interviewed this person. And what he said is, quote, when I go into my grandchildren's room, everything in there is foreign. The shirts, the jeans, the books, the music. Savages. I want to die a communist. That's my final wish. Well, there's a lot of truth to this perspective. That you need a higher purpose in order to explain why you're here, in order to justify why you matter. And that higher purpose isn't just going to be, well, we have a slightly better economic relationship with the West than we would have if Vladimir Putin didn't invade Ukraine. If you don't understand the motivation of the bad guys, you're not going to understand how to stop them. The West seems to be under the grave misimpression since the end of the Cold War that everybody wants the same thing that the West does. And so we make deals with Iran. We make deals with the Taliban. We make deals with the Chinese. We make deals with the Russians. And then we're surprised when none of those deals are actually adhered to. We spend all of our time blowing out the welfare state, destroying our own national energy independence on behalf of Swedish teens who lecture us about how terrible we are for wanting, a functioning world order and economy. And then all of this is slow and it doesn't have a real impact. And then it all materializes at once. And what we are watching is the quickening of history right now. The last 20 years have been a slow roll toward what we have seen in the last 3 years alone. In 2020, China invaded Hong Kong. In 1997, the British turned over control of Hong Kong to the Chinese for the promise by the Chinese that they would allow autonomy in Hong Kong. And then in 2020, the Chinese just rolled right into Hong Kong and nobody did a damn thing. There weren't sanctions of any serious consequence. There wasn't any world reaction. There was nothing in 2020 when China did that. And then in 2021, the Biden administration decided to turn over Afghanistan to the Taliban for no reason at all. We're just going to turn over a country that we had guaranteed security to. Remember, we had worked with those people. They had worked with us. They had sacrificed tens of thousands of lives in a battle with the Taliban. And we just completely undercut them, and then we left them to starvation. That was 2021. And just a few months later, not even a year later, Vladimir Putin has full-scale invaded Ukraine. And by the way, we should note that when it comes to Ukraine, the Ukrainians, again, were effectively guaranteed security by the West in exchange for turning over their nuclear weapons. Right? That had been a deal that the Ukrainians made all the way back in 1994, right after the end of the Cold War. There was really wide debate over whether or not the Ukrainians should turn over their nuclear arsenal. They had about 5,000 nuclear weapons left over after the end of the Cold War. And there were questions, what do you do with this nuclear arsenal? And there were some who suggested they should keep the nuclear arsenal. They should point it at Russia and say, if you cross that border, you're going to regret it. Instead, the United States and Russia encouraged Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. And Ukraine did. John Mearsheimer, I'm not a fan of Mearsheimer, but he's right on this particular issue. In the summer of 1993, according to the New York Times, Mearsheimer, a prominent international relations theorist at the University of Chicago, lent his voice to the issue of atomic retention. He argued in Foreign Affairs a nuclear arsenal was imperative if Ukraine was to maintain peace. The deterrent, he added, would ensure that the Russians, who have a history of bad relations with Ukraine, do not move to reconquer it. In Kiev, the government went so far as to consider seizing operational control of its nuclear missiles and bombers. That never came to pass. Instead, Ukraine punted and demanded, in exchange for nuclear disarmament, it would need ironclad security guarantees. There's an agreement in late 1994 called the Budapest Memorandum, signed by Russia, Ukraine, Britain, and the United States, promising that none of the nations would use force or threats against Ukraine, and all would respect its sovereignty and existing borders. That agreement also vowed that if aggression took place, the signatories would immediately seek action from the UN Security Council to aid Ukraine. Of course, that was a ridiculous agreement on its face, because the UN Security Council is a joke and always has been a joke. I mean, Russia sits on the UN Security Council. Russia did not get a legally binding guarantee of security, but it received assurances. And by 1996, all of its nuclear weapons were gone. And now, Ukraine is being invaded by Russia, and the West is basically doing nothing. We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.